Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference, all about getting started with small ruminants, which are primarily sheep and goats. Today, we have Tim Leard and Kate Johnson, and they are going to be with me talking about post-labor and lamb care. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll just hop into the questions. Kate, why don't you get started, and then we'll hop over to Tim.
Sure. So I'm Kate Johnson, and I have a little farm, Briargate Farm in Longmont, Colorado, and we raise dairy goats. So I know nothing about sheep, but we're the goat people. We're in our 13th breeding season here. It's really just a small hobby farm. We have about 10 does, and we started as a 4-H program for my kids. We started with one doe and a little companion wether 13 years ago. And once my kids aged out, I was pretty attached to the goats, and I had built a new business around it. I started a cheese making school actually about 6 years ago. And we're still doing that, although we're doing it virtually right now as opposed to in person. So my goats are a little bit pets, a little bit 4-H animals. They're part of my milk source for cheese making classes, although we do teach all types of cheese making, not just goat milk cheeses. So that's our story.
All right, Tim, go ahead.
I'm Tim Leard. I live in Northeast Georgia. We have market lamb flock, currently about 75 head total between our breeding ewes and rams and replacement ewes. I've been involved with sheep since the 1980s. At that time, we had a flock of Poll Dorsets. I'm a veterinarian, so I was in practice then. I later sold my practice, went to graduate school, and when we returned from graduate school back to Georgia, we had sold the Dorset flock, so we looked for another breed, and we were interested in a heritage breed that had characteristics that were friendly to the southern environment, the heat stress and parasites, etc. And we decided on the Tunis. So the Tunis we have maintained around on the farm since about 2004. We later decided to add a crossbreed in order to better address meat yield for a market lamb program, and we decided on Texels. So a few years ago, we brought a Texel ram in and initiated that program, and our current focus is maintaining a purebred flock of Tunis for the genetic qualities, and also continuing to establish a crossbred flock, which is turning into about a half and half Tunis Texel cross here. So that's where we are today, and looking forward to the discussions.
Great, thank you guys. So I wanted to preface before we get into the questions that this talk is going to be mostly about once the lamb or the kid has come out of the mom. We've talked about the before stuff in other talks, and so this is just primarily what happens after they've arrived. So before we get started, and Tim, you may not even have a number for this because it's so high, but can you guys talk about maybe how many births that you guys have experienced? And you guys can talk about on farm. Yeah, I was like, Tim, you may not even know the number. But like kind of a guesstimation on how many you've had on farm, and maybe even if you've done some for neighbors and stuff. How many you've done off farm too?
Yeah, well, my number is definitely much smaller because we only breed about 4 or 5 does on average a year. So we've had, 100 plus kids born on our farm, probably about 110 or 120 by now. And then because I am a 4-H leader, I do often help the kids in our 4-H club and people who have bought goats from me. I'll often go and help with kidding. So, probably another couple dozen. So pretty small compared to Tim, I'm sure, but enough that I've probably seen a lot, not everything for sure, but yeah.
It has varied from year to year. At our peak at one point, we had 225 breeding animals here, which was way too many because I do have a full-time job. we reduced the flock after that year, and we've averaged around 50 breeding ewes per year, and that's what we plan to lamb this spring. I did recall one day during lambing season when we had that large number of animals, we had 17 ewes lamb in a single day. I was up at 4 a.m. and I think, we finally finished up about midnight, and I took time to go to work. So the wife was tag teaming back and forth, and we were looking for places to put mamas and babies. It was mayhem. And all of those ewes were bred to the same ram. So it's pretty phenomenal. Reproduction in small ruminants is a totally different ballgame than cattle and swine and a lot of the other historic species that I've worked with and that we've had here on the farm. So yeah, the total number, I could only guess, but it's going to be quite high. But needless to say, we've had a lot of hands-on experience with birthing lambs over the years.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot more. I've not done any, so those numbers are those are good numbers. So just before, and again, before we go any further, I wanted to just mention terms. For sheep, it's ewes are the moms, rams are the dads, and lambs are the babies. And then for goats, it's kids for the babies, does for the moms, and bucks for the dads. So we're going to be throwing those out there. I know, Kate, you mentioned kids as like people kids. So,
Right. Yes.
so I just wanted to kind of double check that, like, that's why we're like,
Yes.
Tim's going to be using different terms than Kate, and it's because there's different terms for each one. So assuming everything went well during the birthing, what are your guys' next steps once the babies come out? How much hands-on interaction do you have, or do you just kind of back off and let nature take its course?
Well, I can go first since we're so small. We probably are, like, in some ways maybe more hands-on just because we have fewer numbers. There's like one of me and one doe kidding at the same time. So we do try to always be there because we hand breed the does, and so we do know their due dates, and we stay pretty close to home and keep a pretty close eye on them. Not so much because they're going to need our help, because I'd say most of the time things go pretty well, but partially because we like to be there, but also when things don't go 100% right, if we are there, our chances of survival are pretty high. We've only lost a couple of kids over the years, and we've lost no does, thank goodness, so far. So what we typically try to do is just be there and see if the mom needs any help. And we've talked about that in another session. And then we usually help dry them off because typically they are having more than one, and typically they come pretty close together. And so she's starting to clean up the first one when the second one comes along, or the third or the fourth. So we're there with towels and we clean them off and just make sure that everything looks okay. And then we usually just sit back and kind of watch for a little bit and see what's going to happen. We do a mix of separating babies and moms and bottle feeding and dam raising, but we usually start out, no matter what our long-term plan is, we start out wanting the kids to nurse from the mom. That's just our style. I know not every dairy goat breeder does it that way. And so we're waiting to see if the kid gets up, and we're making sure that mom is paying attention, and we want the babies to begin nursing, pretty quickly within that first hour or so. And that helps us just determine, and we also double check to make sure mom's got some milk, some colostrum. We always, do a few squeezes here and make sure there's stuff in there. And then we like to really just make sure baby gets on and latches on and all of that. So we can talk more about, what we do after that, but that's usually our first step, and then we also make sure that mom is getting what she needs. We usually give her some grain and give her some molasses water. If it's been a rough delivery, we might do a little bit more than that in terms of some supplements. And similarly with the kids, we don't typically drench them with a Nutri-Drench automatically. If they're strong and hardy and they get right up, we don't necessarily, I know some people do that, but if we have a weaker kid, then we usually are going to do a little intervention. And then within the first, once they're all cleaned up and up, then we're usually going to trim the umbilical cord if it's a little too long and dip it in iodine. So that's kind of the initial protocol of what we do.
What about you, Tim?
We rely on the ewe to pretty much take things in control and birth the baby, clean the baby up, ensure it's nursing, etc. If she doesn't, then that's a strike against her. We have lambing jugs or pens. In sheep world, these little pens are often referred to by the term of jugs, which goes back into European terminology. They're pens that are about 4 to 5 feet square, and we set those up in our barn. So the pregnant ewes are housed or brought in to pens around the barn. We do allow them to continue grazing on pastures in close proximity, but we don't want them too far away. And I would say that 90% of them will lamb in the pens adjacent to the barn. Sometimes a younger ewe, less experienced, or first-time ewe may stay in pasture and lamb, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So we observe that from a distance. I keep an eye on who's in labor, how labor's progressing, how they're delivering. We'll allow her to deliver and clean the lambs up, bond with the lambs. So we'll leave them out there for a while. And then by end of the day, we want to get everybody inside. So we bring the lambs in with the ewe and place them into an individual jug where they stay for a few days to ensure everything's working well and to give us time to process them. So that's our overall approach is it's outdoor lambing, and then we bring them in. If we have an exception situation where we are very concerned about a ewe's health or well-being, or she's had some historic issue or whatever, we may bring her in before lambing, so we have her confined and we can watch her closely. But that's a rare situation. 99% of them are going to lamb out on grass, and then we'll bring them in.
Yeah, and I guess I should clarify that we do use an indoor breeding, our birthing stall. We call it the birthing suite, and we've usually isolated the doe and usually a companion, either a sibling or a mother or whoever she's closest to in the herd. The day or two before to get her acclimated to that stall. But we're more of a pet basis, and also goats don't really like outside elements if it's at all wet. so they're very wimpy about any kind of moisture. So we have a pretty cleaned up stall. We have a big stall that's maybe it's probably about 14 by 14, maybe 14 by 16, that is reserved for kidding. And since we're usually only kidding 1 or 2 at a time, that works pretty well.
So when it comes to the moms cleaning up the babies, that's them licking them off, sometimes eating the afterbirth. You guys mentioned the umbilical cord. Does that just break or come off during birth, or do the moms cut that themselves usually?
I'll let Tim answer first, since he's the medical professional. Then I'll say.
It typically breaks at birth. We don't do anything extraordinary with regard to umbilical cords. Some people will dip them with a little iodine to spray them. That's fine. But the ewe is licking that lamb and cleaning it up, and at that point in time, we don't want to interfere. We don't want any strange scents or smells. We don't want ourselves involved. We want to leave them alone and stay away. And the overwhelming temptation is to run out and grab the lamb and help dry it off and do things. But we feel that's more of an interference, and we really want that bonding to be strong. We don't like bottle feeding babies. There's a novelty and there's a certain appeal to it, but it's another chore that you're adding to that day. And when you've got 50 or 60 or 70 ewes lambing, you've got plenty of chores. Adding bottles isn't something that we look forward to. We almost always end up doing it, one or two, but we try to let that bonding phase go as uninterrupted as possible.
And
Yeah, I think it's an interesting contrast because obviously like Tim's raising animals for meat, whereas we're raising animals for dairy production and showing and human children interacting with them. So a lot of times we are wanting those babies to bond to us as much as, or maybe even more than they're bonding to their mothers, because eventually they are going to get separated and they're going to be handled a lot. And maneuvered a lot and shown, and so we kind of do it for a different reason. And some of us bottle feed intentionally in order to establish that bond. And I do that at some point with every kid, although I do have kids that are 90% dam raised, but at some point those kids will be wilder and much harder for us to handle if we don't do some bottle feeding in that first 3 months. So a lot of times we'll force a bottle fed baby, which I'm sure Tim thinks is just funny because, right, like you don't want that extra work. And we're like, come on, we're gonna make you take this bottle because we want you to bond to us. So it's just a different goal, for the long-term outcome, I think.
yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, Kate, because it's definitely, there's more interaction for dairy animals, more hands-on, I think, than people who are doing meat. A lot of times the meats are there like, no, they just want them to do their own thing. And then, that's less cost for them because they don't have to pay for like milk replacer or things like that for the babies. But like at least on the, because we're doing eventually sheep's milk, that milk from the moms are like so precious that a lot of dairies will immediately pull the babies just so that there's the bottle feeding, and they give them a replacer so that they can use the mom's milk as much as possible. And that's just another way because Kate, you're kind of doing the you got a bit of all the worlds.
Yeah.
But I know some people who go full on dairy who are like, no, we need that milk, so the babies are immediately put on replacer. So I'm glad that you pointed out just it's kind of what's your end goal, and that's kind of how you approach that aspect. So let's talk about when things go wrong. At what point do you guys, we already talked about kind of what point do you step in to like pull the babies out, but once the babies are out, if mom's going through stress, if the baby's struggling, like if it's not breathing or its nose is cold, what kind of steps do you guys take to get the baby breathing or to kind of help mom recover if she's going through shock?
Well, I would start out by saying I probably have not had very many issues with does having problems, and some of that is selection, ahead of time, and I think Tim alluded to that too. That the moms that have had difficult births, most of the moms that I have here were babies born here, so the stock is our stock, and we've kept those because their mother was good. I've had occasionally some older does that start to have some trouble with kidding, and especially if they'd had a year or two off, they may have a difficult delivery. And so for some of those, especially if it was a really difficult delivery in that baby was in the wrong position or stuck or in some way needed a lot of intervention to get the kid out, then that mom might need some care in terms of potentially some antibiotics, although we tend to be pretty prudent about not using a lot of antibiotics if not needed, or maybe some vitamin shots. But typically we haven't needed to do much for the moms. Kids, though, sometimes have a really difficult entry into the world, and maybe that labor took longer and we didn't intervene as soon as we should. And we have had a few weak kids that really were not necessarily, I don't know that we've ever had truly floppy kid syndrome, but we've had some kids that just didn't get up to nurse. I've had 1 or 2 kids that really didn't even have a suck response. Either they were early or they were multiples and they were just the runt of the batch. And so then we're going to work pretty hard to get that baby up and get colostrum in them. Whatever it takes is kind of what we say, because those first few hours are pretty crucial. So we will intervene in that case. And we have sometimes had to give thiamine shot if we've got a really weak kid. And then we have a lot of little tricks just to get them either taking a bottle or even a dropper of milk or of colostrum. So it, varies depending on what's going on. But we have had to bring a few kids into the house and bottle feed them, through the night in order to make sure that they were getting what they needed. But I would say that's definitely the exception and not the rule. And I have, a lot of times those kids, I don't feel like it's necessarily a genetic thing, but just a delivery complication related thing. And usually those kids have gone on to be perfectly strong, healthy does that delivered their own babies just fine.
Same for us. We rarely intercede with a baby unless there was an issue. So all of the females on our farm originated from our first 20 ewes. We've never added females. So we have selected against problems as much as we can. Every selection process is a balancing game between genetics and other factors that you're looking for. But one of the things that's important to us is a ewe that will take care of the lamb, because that's what it's all about. So the situation that we deal with is when there has been an issue. So we've had to assist with lambing, assist with the delivery. And sometimes those lambs will be stressed that they may not hit the ground breathing quickly. So we're fairly aggressive with rubbing them with an old towel or something, a little massage to the chest, things like that. And typically they'll gasp and start breathing. And once they do that, we step away. Then it's mama's ball game. If she's not up, we'll place the lamb at her nose so she can smell it and hear it and see it. And then we'll, of course, watch them fairly closely, but we'll leave her in the pasture of the lot. We don't try to rush everyone indoors. We just want them to be alone and want them to pay attention to each other. Also, typically, if I've had to deliver the lamb, I'm going to check and see if there's a second one or a third, because I want to go ahead in a ewe that has been stressed and minimize any additional stress associated with further labor. So we'll get those lambs out and let her focus on getting them up and going. Kate mentioned colostrum. That's an important word that everyone needs to have in their small ruminant vocabulary. We don't want to overlook that. For newcomers, colostrum is the first milk that the mother produces for the first 2 or 3 days. It's loaded with protein and antibody and energy sources that get that lamb or kid up and going, and it's critical to their survival. So if you have a situation where for some reason the little one is not nursing or is not getting access to milk, don't go straight to milk replacer. You have to get some colostrum into that baby as soon as possible. The gut will close, will stop absorbing those proteins after a day or so, sometimes earlier. So you don't have a long time window there. You want to get that on hand. And oftentimes with our situation, where we almost always have multiple ewes that are lambing, if we have a problem, we can grab someone else and milk some colostrum, and we'll take a syringe and give it to the new baby. So we're sure that they'll get 20 or 30 cc's right off the bat. And typically the colostrum itself is an energy boost, and the lamb will get up and suddenly, you'll say, what happened? Well, he absorbed a lot of energy and the good things out of that colostrum, and then he'll try to nurse his mom. And oftentimes we'll milk the mom, strip some colostrum out, and feed it to the lamb. The other thing that we will do, if there's a problem or we're seeing some reluctance or some slowness to get started of nursing, is we may squeeze her teats and empty them just to be sure there's not a persistent plug, because the teat will develop a plug when the ewe is dry. And we've seen some weaker lambs that had difficulty removing that plug and starting to nurse. And sometimes we'll just pop a little stream of milk or colostrum out of each teat, and then we'll walk away. So we're comfortable then that everything's open, and the lamb, if he has any strength at all, can get started with the nursing process.
Yeah, and I want to just add something, since both Tim and I talked about, selecting for good mothering traits and whatnot. And I think Tim alluded to this earlier, that sometimes you handle a first freshener, and that would be a doe or a ewe in her first year of kidding, a little bit differently, in that her hormonal instincts haven't quite kicked in yet, and her experience hasn't kicked in yet. So I may give a little bit more leeway to those first-time moms in terms of expecting them to do everything right. I have had some first-time moms that, just seemed really caught off guard, like the babies just came out so effortlessly, and maybe they were even a day early and their hormones haven't kicked in, and they seem completely clueless to the whole experience. And if that happens over and over again, that's not a good thing. But in the first year, I might give them a little slack, and say, well, let's see how you do next year, assuming everything else goes well that year. So I probably one of my best does, in fact, two of my best does in terms of mothering, their first year, they were a little caught by surprise by the whole thing. So I just wanted to kind of add that we don't, I do give a little slack to those first time moms.
So some of the behaviors that I know that at least sheep babies have, with, like, if you're ever wondering if they're actually getting the milk, is that their tails will wiggle. And Kate, you can say if that's the same with goats. And then they also will stop whining as much. And those are kind of two signs that the baby's had enough food. Is that the same for goats?
Yeah, it can be, but I've seen a couple of other things too, and there's a couple other things we do to check. I've had one or two kids over the years that look like they're nursing just fine, but they're not really. And I think Tim kind of mentioned this, either they just don't have a strong enough suck, or sometimes it's the shape of the mother's teat and even how full she is. A little tiny baby mouth might just not be able to get around it. And they may be making all the right signs and efforts, and they're up and they're wagging, but they're just not really connecting. And I've noticed, I call it kind of lip smacking. They're kind of going, as opposed to really holding on to that teat and really. So one of the things we do is kind of check the belly. Like, you just can squeeze the belly and it should feel like a little water balloon in there, and that's telling you something's actually getting in there. And if after an hour or two, you're seeing them nursing continually, but you're squeezing the belly and it just feels really empty, then that's probably a case where, just to make sure, I'm going to grab a bottle with a little Pritchard nipple, the little red nipples that are really easy for newborns. And I'm going to just milk some of that mother's colostrum right into the bottle, and then give that to the baby, because then I can see when the bottle's empty, and I'll know for sure that that baby has gotten something. So sometimes everything looks right, but they aren't quite connecting. So we usually will do that little squeeze test to make sure too.
Do you do the same thing, Tim, or do you kind of go, no, I'm just going to wait?
We very similar. We want to be sure that baby is nursing. We've talked about in a couple of these podcasts the instinct, and your familiarity with the animal, and you have a good feeling or you have a bad feeling about how things are going. That's a big deal at lambing. And typically, one reason we want to get them into our lambing jugs is so that we're watching them closer and we're seeing what that baby's doing. If they're out on pasture wandering around, we're going to miss a lot of that monitoring opportunity to see how strong the lamb is and how aggressive it is, and etc. So we will, when we bring them in after lambing, we do check udders. That's a standard procedure to be sure the teat is open. We will squeeze a little milk out. If the milk flows freely, we know the baby has already nursed. The plug's gone, so it would be one or more of the lambs who've done that. want to ensure that we don't have an udder that's very swollen or edematous. Some ewes sometimes will have udders that accumulate fluid. We'll see this in all animals, and that fluid may compromise the ability for the lamb to have access to the teat or to empty it. And we may need to intervene, either milk her for a day or so and help get that pressure down, or there are some medications that your vet could advise if in an extreme case, but that's unusual. We do check the lamb. We want to look him over a little bit, be sure that there's nothing obvious that's wrong with him. We do check that full belly response. A lamb that's full and that's happy is going to nap. One of the things that people walk into the lambing barn and they'll look around and say, are they dead? Well, no, they're snoozing. But that's a good question, because if a lamb's not getting nutrition, how do you tell whether it's really weak or whether it's just has a full belly and is he's growing? So part of that is instinct and understanding how the animal behaves and how they look. And it varies from lamb to lamb. There are individual variations. And last year we had a couple of lambs from a year, I remember, that we actually kept up an extra day or two because they just didn't look right, though they were nursing and they were getting milk and they went on to do fine. It was just that instinct thing that, I wanted to be sure every time I checked the ewe, they were taking pressure off the udder, there was milk there, everything looked good. And they turned out well, but maybe I was overly cautious. But watching them closely and learning what to look for and what the signs are, and they should be up and down, and they should be tempting the nurse, and that tail wag, I think, is a great sign. I agree. If I see two lambs latched on each side and mom is happy and chewing her cud and the lambs are wagging tails, then all is good. If they're not, then I need to investigate a little closer.
Yeah, and to what Tim said about the sleeping babies, I would also add how they're sleeping is important, because if they're curled up and look all sweet and cozy, that's great. If they're flat out on their side and sprawled, not so good. so how they're sleeping is important too. Sometimes you'll come out and I've had a few kids that, they're just the sleepiest babies ever, but they look content as they're sleeping, and they're curled up in a little ball and probably snuggled up with the sibling or what have you. But the ones you come out and they're flat on their side and really sprawled out, that's not such a good sign. Hypothermia, or, they're not getting any nutrients. And those are the ones I'm picking right up and doing something with.
Yeah, that lamb lying on its side is I always check that one.
Yeah.
And it depends on the ambient temps, and if it's hot weather, they're going to stretch out. We lamb in typically February, so it's cool, but our barn is open. We don't close the sides in, so there are breezes going through, and the ambient temperature is pretty close to the outside temp. And if it's cool weather, they should curl up. And if they're stretched out, or if one is stretched and the twin is not, then I want to take a look at that lamb. I want to see what's going on, just to be sure. And they'll stretch. Sometimes they'll lay on the side, and that's fine, but they shouldn't stay there.
Right.
At some point, they should curl back up or get up or whatever. So, and sometimes I'll just stand him up and say, "Hey, is everything okay?"
Right.
And I'll watch him walk around. So it's worth taking a second to check that one out.
I would add too, because I think I've heard this before, is that the temperature of their noses too. Like if their noses are cold, that means that they probably haven't had their milk. If it's nice and warm, then they have. Is that correct?
It probably depends a little bit on, what the temperature is out there. We raise Nubian dairy goats, so they have the long floppy ears. So a lot of times the ear temperature is also a sign. If it's pretty warm out and you're feeling that ear and it's really cold, that's probably not such a good sign. Yeah.
Yeah, I place my hand under the lamb's chest, and I get a feel for its body temperature. And if it feels cool, then I'm concerned, because it really, under the chest between the legs, should be warm. So that's one of the, I feel more comfortable with that than I do the nose thing. But I just, it may be an indication, but you need to check a little further, I think, and just see if that lamb feels chilled or cool, or if his temps are comparable to his sibling or to his mama.
When you guys mentioned the squeeze, the tummy, so it's like if you're your hands under there anyway, then you'll probably feel the temperature as you're checking the the squishiness of their tummy. Um, you guys both mentioned using syringes and bottles to get like colostrum and milk into the babies. Do you guys not do tubing then? And why not?
I personally don't do tubing. I mean, that would for me be really a last resort. I feel like it's pretty, especially I wouldn't do it myself. I would have a vet do it. Now Tim's been a vet, so he would probably be able to do it. But I don't feel confident enough to do that just as a first choice, because it would be pretty easy to accidentally aspirate the baby and get that fluid into the lungs. So if I have a baby that's that weak that I feel like tubing is going to be necessary, that's probably something I personally am going to have the vet or a more experienced somebody that's done that before. Tubing for me would only be necessary if a kid has no suck response. And if they're that weak, that's probably going to need a vet intervention from my perspective. Now, I have had newborn kids that needed a dropper because they didn't have that suck response yet. And like Tim said, that colostrum is such an energy boost that once we got some of that colostrum in there, they eventually did start sucking on their own. And our kind of rule of thumb is 6 ounces in 6 hours. And so those first 6 hours to me is like really crucial. And I might not even be able to get a vet out that quickly. And so I have had, 1 or 2 kids over the years that I've had to just drop little droppers of colostrum in them kind of continuously for that first 6 hours. It's pretty high labor. Luckily, it doesn't happen very often.
I will stomach tube in a heartbeat. It's just more efficient for us when we have a barn full and we're working through them. If we've got a lamb that's weak, I can grab a syringe and milk the syringe full, pass the tube and inject the milk, and then the lamb has it and I'm done. And I can go on and do other things because it's time consuming to work with the lamb and the bottle and try to get the milk into them. And I want to get it in him and I want him to absorb it quickly. And then I want to be able to assess that response while I'm in the barn, because I'm not there all day. I'm in and out. And so as Kate mentioned, I'm a vet, so passing a stomach tube to me is not a big deal, but most people are not. But it may be worth learning and talk to your veterinarian or an animal health technician or someone who's a mentor. Some of these skills are things that you may want to pick up on. The key for me is I can feel that tube going down the neck. If I can't feel it, then I'm in the trachea, and I do not want to put milk in the lungs because I've killed it if I do. So it's not overly difficult, but it does have a risk that is significant. So you want to be comfortable if you're thinking about doing that. I also have seen lambs and kids in practice where they were fed with a syringe or dosed and they inhaled the milk. So even using a syringe is not without risk, because you could still get it into the trachea and then you'd have pneumonia. So another aspect of being able to pass that tube is I know that I bypassed the lung, I'm in the stomach, and so the lamb's going to benefit as quickly as possible. So there are pros and cons to each, but talk to your veterinarian, someone who's qualified and experienced, and get their feedback and think about what your options are. But be careful. When you're using a syringe, you want to go slowly and you want to drip it in and make sure they're swallowing it. If you give it too fast, you could get it into the trachea or the windpipe and it would go into his lungs.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, that eventually learning to do these things yourself makes a lot more sense. And have we had that need more than once or twice in 13 years, for sure, I would probably have gotten some training on it. because there's a lot of other things that in that first year or two of kidding, I spent a lot of money on vet bills, and I learned pretty quickly to do those things myself. So this probably is one that ought to be on my to-do list to learn, but we just haven't had to use it very often, which is a good thing.
I also think it's the same thing as the more lambs you're having, the more possibility that things are going to go wrong. You know, you have a smaller farm, so you know the percentages that something's going to go wrong is probably lower than say Tim's because he's got more. Um, let's go back to the moms. Um, for new moms, because I think you'd mentioned, Kate, sometimes it takes them a bit to get their milk to come in. Um, are there any tips or tricks to help a mom who's maybe just taking a little bit longer to get her milk in, especially for that first time, those first time moms? Are there anything that us as farmers can do to kind of help that come along if they're struggling?
Yeah, well, so, of course, since we are raising dairy animals, we're going to be milking them eventually anyhow. And we do hand milk. And so I haven't seen it so much with my own does. I've had one or two whose milk came in a little after the fact, even the colostrum. And so, and this is a different question than you answer or asked, but we always do have colostrum on hand from either from other does who have kidded earlier in the season, and we collected some of their colostrum if they had plenty extra and froze it, or from a previous year. We try not to go to colostrum replacer unless we absolutely have to, but we will if we do have to. And so what we'll do if we do have a doe that hasn't come into her milk, once the kids are on the ground, is just to actually go through the motions of milking her. And we'll do that 2 or 3 times a day to really help stimulate that production of the milk. And usually within a few days that milk will then come in that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a good practice early in lambing or kidding season. If you have that ewe or that doe that's a good producer and she has a nice full udder of colostrum, and especially if she only has one offspring, I'll often milk the other side and freeze that colostrum, and I'll divide it up. I won't freeze it in a single bag. I'll divide it up into individual doses, which are 20 or 30 mils and about an ounce. And freeze those. So then if I have a problem during the season, I've got fresh colostrum from this season, from the animals in this barn, and I can thaw one out and pass the stomach tube or give it with a bottle or whatever to get that little one started off. I don't like purchased colostrum. I'm not comfortable that it's adequate. I agree with Kate. The ideal thing is colostrum. Fresh colostrum, and much safer if you use it from your farm. If you buy it from other sources, you don't know the health status of those animals. So think about that. I don't have a problem using colostrum that I froze the year before, as long as it stayed frozen. I don't like to go on and on and on with it. I want to get it out and replace it. But if it's early in lambing season and I'm just starting, and the only colostrum I have is some that I kept over from last year, I'll use it. But my preference is to look for that ewe who's coming in, has a single, she has a lot of colostrum and milk, and I can restock, and then I'm set for that season.
Yeah, and I agree. Like we have a couple of, because we're in 4-H and I have a co-leader that raises dairy goats also, and I know she has a really clean, healthy herd. And then I have another mentor who helps a lot with my breeding program, who also is really meticulous about his herd. I will ask for colostrum from them if I'm in a pinch, but I wouldn't probably take it from a stranger or some farm that I didn't know the health of the doe.
I would also add that don't give goat colostrum to sheep or vice versa, or cow colostrum to goats, etc., because the proteins are different. So you really need to use colostrum from the same species to ensure that they're going to absorb the proteins and the nutrients properly. You might get an energy boost, but you're going to miss out on some of the other benefits.
Yeah. For frozen colostrum, do you guys warm it up before giving it to them? I'm assuming.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was like, that was a point that I remember for when we had, because we, our flock was all babies when we got them, and it was making sure that the whatever we gave them was warm up to a certain point. As soon as they got to a certain age, it didn't matter as much. But at least at first, you have to make sure it's slightly warmer than room temperature, or would you say room temperature is fine?
Slightly warmer.
Yeah, a little warmer because their body temperature is warmer. One thing I will warn people though, that, when you're warming up that colostrum, you have to do it very gently or it will curdle. So you don't want to like stick it in the microwave or something, because then you just have chunks which aren't going to go through the nipple. So you have to do a really gentle heating of it. What we usually do is we keep little, those little miniature soda bottles, and we'll squeeze a couple of ounces of colostrum into those little bottles, put the lids on, freeze them. And then those are perfect because you can just take them out and put them in a hot water bath and then screw on the little Pritchard nipple and you're good to go.
Yeah, that's perfect. We have hot and cold water, running water in a pharmacy in our barn. I keep a sink there for various uses, and during lambing season, there's always a bucket or some container that I'll run warm water in, and I'll drop that bag of colostrum into that water and let it thaw while I'm doing chores, and then I'll come back once it's thawed and warmed up, and I'll test it on my wrist, just like you would a baby formula. If it's hot on my wrist, it's too warm. You don't want to burn them. You want it body temperature. So if it feels neutral to you or slightly warmer than your temperature, then you're right in the correct area. You don't want to give them cold material, because oftentimes these newborns have a body temperature that's too low, and that's one of the things that's making them weak and stressing them. So giving them the colostrum or supplemental milk is a way to warm them up a little bit. So I tend to err on it being a little bit warm to the touch before I give it.
Great. That's good to know about the heating it up too fast. A lot of these, so I just had a baby, and this is my second, and a lot of these tips are definitely stuff that I've heard just for people as well. So it's like just kind of reiterating, okay, it's kind of the same process for like both humans and animals. They're a little different, but there's definitely a lot in there that I'm like, oh yeah, that I remember that. I remember that. Yep. I'm doing that now. Yep.
Yeah. Similarly, I always have people ask like, well, what if I don't want to milk a goat? I'm like, well, then don't get it pregnant, because they don't just walk around with milk. It's just like humans, right?
Yeah.
Got to have a baby first.
Yes. There's a lot of people who are like, well, do you absolutely need them to have babies to have milk? And I'm like, yeah, yes, they're not like chickens. Chickens, you don't necessarily need a ram or need a rooster to have eggs, but that's
Right.
not the same for ruminants. So let's go through, now that the babies are here, they've had their colostrum. At what point do you guys give them their shots, dock, if you guys dock, if you guys do any of the castrations for wethers, or what's the term for castrated male goats, Kate?
It's wethers.
It's wethers
also.
too. Okay. So kind of at what point, at what age do you guys kind of deal with the shots and all that other stuff, if you do them?
Well, we do give the CD&T vaccination, and we give it to the does about a month before they kid, and that will be their spring vaccine, and then that will give the kids a little initial immunity. And then we do two vaccinations after kidding, and we do it at 6 and 9 weeks. I'll be curious to hear what Tim says. I hear different things from different people, but my main goat mentor, who's been doing this for about 30 years, that's how he does it. And so that's kind of how we do it. The only time we would do 3 vaccines, and we have had to do that, is if the doe herself didn't get that spring booster before she kidded, then we're probably going to do a 3 vaccine series for the kids. And then we, of course, don't do anything with the tails, but we do disbud the babies because in the dairy goat world, we really don't want horns around full udders of milk or in stanchions or with fencing or in collars. And because we show the goats, we're not allowed to have horns. So we do disbud our babies, usually between about 5 and 7 days, depending on the size of the kid. And then for castrating, if we are going to keep, most of our bucks, we will, buckling kids, we will castrate because there's not a very big market for bucks unless I know that I'm going to be keeping a buckling, or I know I have someone to sell them to as a buckling. We usually castrate at about a month. And that's mostly because they just start to develop a bucky temperament and they start harassing everybody. And we've gone later than that, and that's okay. But I find at about a month, it seems to be good. We do banding as our technique, so also having them a little bit smaller, I think is just a little easier on them.
Yeah, very similar for us. We've fluctuated over the years between castrating all the males and not castrating, or castrating part of them or whatever. But all the procedures that we want to do to that lamb, we'd like to accomplish that while they're in the lambing jug. So they'll stay in the barn for 3 to 7 days, depending on whether they're singles or twins, and whether it's a first-time ewe or she has lamb for several years and has everything down pat and she's just ready to go back to the field. So during that period of time, we will tattoo all of our sheep, have a tattoo in the right ear, and I tattoo them using a letter that designates the year of birth based upon the Canadian livestock tattoo system, which is standardized to the calendar year. So for example, last year was G or H, maybe it's H. I get behind, but anyway. And then there'll be 2 or 3 numbers, and the numbers are just order of birth. So we're tattooing and changing that last number as each lamb is worked. We will administer the CDT vaccine, which is Clostridium perfringens type C and D, plus tetanus. And we will give that under the skin behind the foreleg to each lamb. And typically I will give the ewe a dose at the same time. So the ewes are getting their tetanus dose at the same time the lamb is getting their dose. So I will talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. The other thing we'll do is tail dog, and we do dock all tails on our sheep. So we use a band, and we'll apply the band at the end of the fold. There are 2 folds of skin beneath the tail in the lamb, and we want that band to sit right where those folds join the tail. So that's a rough guideline that we use. Some folks here who show sheep prefer a shorter tail. I don't like shorter tails, especially in females, because there may be some compromise of the structure around the perineal region and predisposition to other issues later in life. So I prefer to have a tail that's a little bit longer, but not too long. So it's a personal thing you need to adjust to as you go through it over time. The lambs, the tails will drop off in a couple of weeks. We don't do anything particular to them. We apply the band. If the tail is dirty or soiled, we'll clean it. So when we're working lambs, there's typically a little bucket with some soap and water and a towel or something, or washcloth in it, and we'll clean them up a little bit. And then we'll put the band on. I don't like to put it on top of fecal material or contamination. If we're castrating the lamb, we will castrate them at the same time, and we will use a band for that as well. And it's important, particularly if some of the smaller lambs, to be sure both testicles are in the scrotum when you apply the band, because sometimes one will slip by, and that has happened in previous years. My boys helped me a lot, and we emphasize technique to be sure that you get both of them or you're defeating your purpose. But when you're starting out, it may be easy to let that happen. And I have actually cut a band off. I keep a pocket knife handy in my pocket. So, and reapply it because one of the testicles slipped up into the abdomen or under the skin, and I missed it.
Mm.
But that's again a technique thing, and it comes with practice. I always have someone holding the lamb, and I administer these various treatments, or I hold it, and one of my sons or assistants will administer it. One thing that I will point out when we're handling these lambs, by this time, typically the ewes are bonded, but I did have a situation one year where I had an assistant come in. He was holding the lambs, and we had just started working the group that day, and he put the lambs down and we jumped into the next jug, and I heard a bang sound. I looked around, and the ewe was viciously attacking her lambs. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and we were thinking, what on earth is going on? And then it popped into his mind. He said, I was carrying my dog around before I came to the
Mm.
barn. So the smell from the dog on his jacket had gotten on the lambs, and the ewe could smell the dogs. So we had to pull the lambs out and bathe them and clean them up, and then put them back in the stall. Of course, then they didn't have much scent, and she was a little confused, but at least she didn't attack them. And she regained her faith that these were in fact sheep and they were hers. But that's the situation you want to be cautious about. And I keep an old apron in the shop that I can throw in a washing machine periodically. And my assistant, whoever's holding the lamb, wears that apron. So that apron only has sheep smell, because we have cats and dogs and all sorts of other animals around the farm. And it's tempting to walk over and hug the horse and then go into the sheep barn. We don't want to do that. We want that lamb against that apron that's only had sheep smell. So we avoid that potential rejection risk. So those are the things that we'll do. We'll check them over while we have them in hand. I'll look at their eyes, look at feet, legs, etc., and umbilicus to be sure there's no issues, no evidence of any infection. Everything is coming along as we expect, and then we'll put them right down. We stand in the jug with the mother, so she sees them and she's right there talking to us. Sometimes she's running circles around us as she's a young ewe, but we reassure her, and oftentimes as soon as we finish working the lambs, we'll give her a little bit of feed just as a reward. Everything's good, babies are good. Thank you for bearing with us for a few minutes, because she's worried about them, and they'll be lying down in the band. They'll feel the bands for a few minutes. And so the mama oftentimes will be, what's going on here? So we want to distract her a little bit. But in a few minutes, they'll numb, and then the babies are up normal and everything is fine. There are other methods that different people employ, and it's a matter of personal preference. But for us, the band is fast and easy and clean, and we almost never have complications historically, provided we give the tetanus shot. Kate mentioned tetanus boosters. That's a great point. Vaccines will not work if the individual already has antibody on board against that disease. So when the lamb nurses the mother, if the mother has a level of immunity that's fairly high against that disease, then that's passing to the lamb, which is a huge advantage in protecting the lamb. But if the mother has a very high tetanus titer, or a level of antibodies against tetanus, the lamb's going to absorb those, and those antibodies will neutralize the vaccine, so it doesn't respond to the vaccine. So the key is to give a booster at the period of time or the age when that lamb's maternal antibody, the antibody that they receive from the colostrum, which we call maternal source, has dropped off. It's temporary. It only lasts a few weeks and it's gone. And for us, that booster occurs at weaning, and we often wean around 90 days, no later than 4 months. I much prefer 3 months. And if it's an animal that's staying on the farm, we will booster them again at a future date when we're working them for routine health checks. So to Kate's point, I'd like to see those replacement ewe lambs get 3 doses at birth, or during that first week of age, at weaning, and then at some time before they reach a year of age. The mothers get 1 dose a year, and typically it's at lambing. Or maybe at foot trimming. If I see an issue in a ewe, I may give a dose at foot trimming. just to booster them. But that's unusual. Typically, all the adults on the farm are getting 1 dose a year. The rams, at the end of breeding, when we're loading them in the trailer and taking them back to their pastures, we'll pump them with a dose of CDT, and that's their annual dose. So we do these things when we're handling the animals already, and try to build it into a little more efficient system.
Yeah, and I would say we used to do a once a year vaccination for our does, but our local vet school a few years back started recommending twice a year for the does. I think that was mostly for the Clostridium. So we actually do a fall and a spring booster for the does. And so we put the kids on that schedule too. I mean, they get their first ones when they've kidded, but come fall, they're going to get another round with their dams. Also, I just want to add, we also do tattoo because we have registered show animals. So typically we tattoo around a month because the ears are big enough to tattoo at birth, but I find that as they continue growing, sometimes the tattoo kind of gets misshapen and it's hard to read. So we wait till about a month and we tattoo them, and they get a 2-ear tattoo because the 1 ear is our herd identification tattoo, and then the other is similar to what Tim said. It's a letter for the year and a number for the birth order.
Tim,
That's a good point. If I could comment on the Clostridium. If you're placing your kids or lambs on feed versus pasture, and they're going to have a lot of concentrate in their diet or feed supplement in their diet, it is important to give boosters on the Clostridial vaccine because Clostridium perfringens type C and D is associated with high energy diet.
Right.
The tetanus, I'm very comfortable. Tetanus is very immunogenic. The protection lasts for a long time in humans, where you take a vaccine every 10 years for tetanus. But Clostridium perfringens is a different story, and we want to be sure that if our lambs are going on feed, and we typically raise our lambs on pasture with limited creep, but I may finish them. I may push some of these wethers to finish on feed in order to get them to market, especially some of the slower growing ones. And I'll booster them because I'm concerned about what we call overeating disease, or the perfringens C and D. So you can Google overeating disease and get some summaries on the effects. But that booster is not a bad idea in those individuals.
Yeah, and Tim brings up a good point that where you are in the country too is probably also going to be determining how you're raising your animals. Tim's in Georgia, where it's much more temperate and you've got more moisture, and so pasture raising is an option. Here in Colorado, where we're pretty drought, we're semi-arid here on a good year, and we've been in drought years for many years now, as was attested to the horrible fires that you probably all heard about here this summer, which was pretty scary for us in the state. So we also don't have a lot of property. We have about 5 acres, and we have horses, 2 horses as well. So we don't have nearly enough roughage to even think about pasture raising our animals. So they are supplemented, and especially when they're in milk, because they are dairy animals, they need a lot more calories to produce the milk. So that is probably one of the reasons that in our area, that twice a year vaccine is recommended. So that's going to probably vary depending on where you are in the country,
Yes.
because that's going to also determine what your main food source is.
That's a good point, because you're going to hear a lot of input from us and from other people. But in the end, it's important to tailor the healthcare system to your system, to what works for you. And that will vary between neighbors even. Size of flock, your management style, genetics, environment, etc. So have a lot of mentors, a big pool of mentors that you rely on. What do you do, and what do you do, and what do you do? And then extrapolate your processes and procedures and practices that work best, which requires trial and error. And
Yeah,
over
and it
time, you'll work
changes,
out a system. Yeah,
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 and it changes
correct.
over time. When I
Yes,
first started, like for instance, parasite control, we had one protocol that our local veterinarian said, and that's changed over the years.
absolutely.
So, just because it was the recommendation at one time, you want to keep asking the question
Yep,
every year.
yep. My sons are good. They'll challenge me. Why do we do that? Do you think we still need to do it? And I said, well, that's a good question. I tend to get set in my ways.
Yeah.
I've always done it, but that's not a good reason. so, so it's good to force yourself to reassess periodically. And if you see an issue popping up, think about what's happening. And do you need to make an adjustment in order to address that issue?
Yeah, and to that point, we haven't talked about coccidia prevention, and
Yep.
that's another thing that it could some breeders will do with kids. They'll just, as a matter of course, everybody will go on a coccidia prevention regimen as newborn kids. And for me, I don't typically do that because I haven't had issues with coccidia. But then I had a year or two where we had an occasional little coccidia outbreak, and or one kid that had it, and so we then for a little while were like, okay, well, let's just give everybody around, or if I have one kid that gets it, I'm just going to go ahead and do a preventative round for everyone. So that too might change over time. And I think
Yep.
if you are a breeder that had issues regularly, you may have that as part of your just regular regimen, but if you didn't, you might
Correct.
not. So that would
Correct.
be another example.
We also, I think, talked in a different discussion about how your animals will build immunities, and I think maybe we mentioned this a little bit earlier too, to some of the vaccines. I think we talked primarily dewormer, like using a variety of different brands or just different things for the animals because they will specifically get a immunity to that specific brand, and so then switch it because it might have something else in it that they're not used to. Um, and I think that's kind of what you guys are leading to as well, is that your animals will sometimes get the immunities to the vaccines and not even so much the parasites, but the vaccines. And then it doesn't work anymore. And so that's why that constant going back and reaffirming and readjusting your management style as things change. Um, so I'm glad you guys pointed that out. Now I don't know, Tim, your sheep don't have horns, or do they?
They are polled. We may see a scur on occasion, but both our breeds are polled, so we do not disbud.
Okay. And I think there was like two terms as like dehorning, debudding. To me, debudding sounds like the castration part, but it's actually the horn. um,
Well,
I like
for
that.
us, that
I guess
yeah,
it's a matter of perspective.
Yeah,
the
like I
difference,
don't know.
Yeah.
right? The difference is whether a horn. I think whether a horn has developed yet, then it's dehorning.
Yeah.
At least that's the way we look at it, and that's a much bigger procedure than disbudding, which
Mhm.
is where you're
Absolutely.
basically cauterizing those cells so that they don't develop a horn, and that's much less invasive and much easier to recover from. So that's why
Yeah.
doing it early is so important. You can't wait until they're a month old and think you're going to disbud them because they've got a horn now. You're dehorning
Yeah.
them, and I've had to do that once with a young wether we bought for one of our 4-H kids, and we kind of bought him sight unseen, but he was in quarantine and we couldn't pick him up, and they said he had some scurs, which are that little bit of horn cell that's not a big deal. When we went to pick him up, it was a horn. And we'd already kind of committed to him, and the little girl was in love with him, and he had to have a surgery to be dehorned. And it was not a simple procedure for that poor goat. It was much more painful. So, I always try to remind the 4-H kids, because, in the excitement of your first kidding and you've got these babies and you're all busy, you can sometimes just sort of forget that there was that next step that you've got to do. And if you don't do it in that first week or so, it's a much bigger deal for the baby.
Absolutely. I would emphasize that, debudding at a very young age is the ideal approach and the safest approach and the most economical approach. removing the horn from a buck or a ram is a huge deal. The in cattle, it's a different ball game because the density of the skull and the way the horn grows and attached is very different than in bucks and rams. In bucks and rams, the skull tends to be thinner. The blood supply is richer because they tend to grow more massive horn in relationship to the size of the skull. And if you're thinking, well, we'll just wait and dehorn him, you need to talk to a veterinarian and get a firsthand understanding of the risk and the anesthesias and the bleeding and the surgery and the follow-up and the healing, because it's a huge deal. You don't want to do that. You want to use a cautery system and debud them, and you want to be sure you do it properly, because I've seen some cauterizations that were not done properly and we had a partial horn and then we still had to do surgery. So talk to the veterinarian or someone who's experienced, a mentor, a neighbor like Kate who's done this many times and can show you the proper procedure for ensuring that you're cauterizing the entire perimeter of that bud. Otherwise, it won't fall off. So be very careful with the technique and ensure that it's done properly.
Yes, and I will confess that I don't do my own debudding because I'm a little bit too chicken, but also because I'm just really lucky that I have a great mentor who is less than 5 minutes away, who I can pop my kids in the car, drive them over there. He does a great job, and then we're done. And it's you know, he charges me a very nominal fee, and we more trade off on helping each other with milking. So that is one skill that I have not had to learn, but if I didn't have that resource, then yeah, I would have to have learned it. And one reason I don't is because I have this great deal and he's so good at it because he's been doing it for
That's
so
great.
long that it's also just much less stressful on the kid because he's very efficient and very quick. And I've never had a single issue with any of the debuddings that he's done for me.
I love that. I think in other talks we've talked about, just kind of trying to figure out what's in your area, whether it's just farms in your area or vets specifically. I know a lot of people are like, before you get animals, make sure you have a good vet in your area. And if it's a little bit of a further drive, if it's a good vet, then, it's worth it. But, just to be aware of your resources. And it seems like a lot. Like I know that we've like talked about it, and there's still a whole lot more to talk about. And so it seems like a lot, but I think once it becomes more familiar, just make sure you're really prepared when you're doing it the first time. Knowing if your breed does have horns. I don't know if ours do, so that's research I have to look into. I don't think they debudded ours, so I think they don't need to. So because we got them pretty within a week, and I just don't think that they did it. But that's one of those things that I need to double check. So I'm glad we mentioned the horns, because I don't think a lot of people think about that ahead of time, because it's just, I don't know, when you think of lambing, you don't think of, well, what are they going to look like when they're adults? And what do you need to do so quickly because of those issues that you'll have later on?
Yeah, and I would just add too, for people who are going to get into dairy goats, obviously you're probably not going to keep them all because it is exponential math and pretty soon you have way too many animals. So one of the things that we try to talk to our 4-H community about when they're going to be raising these dairy animals is you do have to be thinking about your market for selling these babies. And for sure, dairy animals that have horns, you have a very limited market of who's going to buy those babies. So even if you personally maybe don't care if they have horns or not, if you're going to be selling kids and you're selling them as a 4-H project or as a show animal, or really most of the dairy goat people don't really want to have those horns. So you have to be thinking of it in that perspective too, just what your market is going to want. Because every year I get people trying to give away a free goat. And if it has horns, my market for where I can even give that goat away is really limited. But if it's debudded, I have a lot more places I might be able to help them find a home for it.
That's I would say in addition to that for the sheep dairy, as a lot of people prefer docked tails when for milking because then the tails aren't getting in the way. So some people prefer that, some people don't. We don't. We got ours and they weren't docked, and so we didn't worry about it. And we're like, well, let's see what the first year is like with the tail swinging. And we'll see if like we're like, no, this is just a hassle. We need to dock them. But some people don't care. So that's another thing to keep in mind again when you're selling on the sheep dairy end is for the docked tails because you are going to be in that area a lot. And at least from what I'm seeing, there's a lot of dirt and grime that is attached to those tails. And
Oh yeah.
you know, some people if they're milking, they don't. You know, that's a lot of dirt that's
Yeah.
swinging
It gets
around.
old. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And it's a
at least
health risk for the milk quality as well.
yes, yes. So
One other point I'll make with regard to these lambing procedures, we mentioned castration. There are some markets for lamb where the buyers prefer an intact male. And I've had customers who ask that I not castrate uh, the ram lambs that they will buy. Some of the ethnic customers prefer that they be intact. So think about your market. To Kate's point, you know, how you're going to dispose of these surplus animals, and in our situation, our primary product is a market lamb. That's one reason we have shifted a bit from castrating everything to only castrating part of the animals, so I can have animals for the different market niches that are out there.
Yeah, and to that point for the goats, out here in Colorado, in some parts of Colorado, there are some areas where people will pack with goats. So hiking and packing with goats. And typically those people want horns on their animals. However, we raise Nubians and they're not known as a good pack goat. They're temperamental and they tend to be lazy on the trail. So, you know, we don't have a huge market for that where I am, but I know breeders of other breeds like the Alpines are great pack goats. And if they're in a more mountainous part of Colorado where that is a big market for their males, they're more likely to leave those horns on for that reason. So knowing what your market is before you start having those babies is really good because it's going to vary even just where you are geographically and what breed you have.
Yep.
yeah, I would agree with that. So how often do you guys weigh your kids and your lambs, and how hard or how deeply do you guys track their weight as they grow?
Yeah, so I'm probably easier answer is we really don't care. I mean, because we're not selling a market animal, so weight isn't that important to us, and because we're really just a little hobby farm. I mean, you know, in our 4-H record books, there is a place for the kids' weight. So in that respect, some of those 4-H project members might need it. I personally am not too concerned about the weight of the kid because, to Tim's point about instinct, you know, you're doing it based on what you're seeing. And yeah, I might have a little tiny kid, and then I know I'm going to have to maybe treat it a little differently. But because they're not market animals, I don't really track weight with kids.
We do. The most used piece of equipment on our farm is the scale. So we will weigh that lamb when we're working him. I don't weigh them at birth because that's another distraction from you. Some people want a birth weight, but our first weight is not actually a birth weight. It's first week of age weight, whatever it is. So when we're handling them for the tail docking, castration, etc., they'll go on a bucket that's on a hanging scale. We'll write that weight down. I know he's gained a little bit since birth, but if we're processing everyone at about the same age within a couple of days, I'm not worried about that. It just gives me a feel when I look back at the records over time of whether this ewe is delivering very small lambs, which don't tend to perform as well, or whether she's having lambs that are too big if I've had to assist them. You know, those are two extremes that worry me a little bit, and they might factor into my selection criteria. And if I have that weight written down, I can see who she is, and I'm not trying to rely on my memory, which one of those 50 ewes had that tiny little baby 2 years ago. So it gives me some basis for making the decisions based upon the actual data. We also will weigh the lambs at weaning. I want to see how they performed. I want to, a part of that goes into selecting future ram candidates. If they aren't hitting a pound a day, then I'm going to move them into the market lamb pen. So we've had a half a dozen ram lambs this year that were bumping 100 pounds at weaning on mama's milk and pasture. And this is the first year we've had that kind of turnaround, but most of these are the ones that are in our crossbred program with the Tunis and Tetzel cross. And that's exciting. And I want to know who they are, and I want to ensure that I'm pulling them aside and they're going to go back in our commercial flock. Because I don't have a outside source of rams for that flock. I have to use the ones we produce since it's a custom cross. On the Tunis side, the purebred Tunis, we have modified our phenotype over the years. Our initial flock was the old style Tunis, which are a little smaller. We've tried to put a little bit of size on them, though we do not want to turn them into red Suffolks or Hampshires. We want them to be, a moderate size, reasonable, easy to handle and deal with, but good mothers and raise good babies with good milk production and parasite tolerance and heat tolerance. So those are the factors that go into it, and having a scale. So I'm weighing those babies and I see how they're performing during lactation. That's an indication of how well not only the lamb is performing his or her genetics, but also the mom's genetics, because milk production is a big part of how they perform. And the Tunis are noted for having good milk production, and some people will use them for dairy. And we have milked some along the way, just from different circumstances. Ended up milking a ewe, making yogurt or whatever, and it's quite good. But the scale is something that we utilize and we feel is important. We also use it to monitor the mothers, and I'll see what their weights look like at weaning. How much have they lost, and then I will weigh them again during the summer to make sure they're gaining and they're putting weight back on and there's not some issues, so I can get them ready to breed again in the fall.
At what point do the lambs start eating feed more than they do the milk? Like I know that you guys have the plan on this is the date that we're weaning them. But at what point do they naturally start to kind of eat with the same stuff as their parents?
For lambs, our lambs will be in the feed pan before we take them out of the lambing jugs. They'll be nibbling on feed with mama out of curiosity at first, but they will start to eat a little bit, certainly not relying more on feed than they're on milk at that point. But at least the curiosity is sparked and they know what feed is. And we'll set up a creep feeder. So when the lambs and the ewes are first turned on pasture, there is a creep feeder available for those lambs to have access to. So that's fairly constant. I may limit it a little bit depending on the pasture conditions because I want to see how well they perform on pasture. This year we had very good grass, and so we minimized creep feeding. So most of our lamb growth was on mama's milk and grass, which, as I said earlier, is a genetic thing that I personally want to follow and see how it does. But in a situation where you have limited forage, and in some years here where we've dealt with dry conditions and we have forage issues, we have relied more on creep feeding. And I make notations of that in our records so that we know from year to year how they're performing and how we're managing them. But I would say they're heavily into feed within a month of age. They're when I go to that creep feeder, they're lined up. They know I'm coming. They want to see. And I say wean at 90 days. That's an average. We lamb over a 4 to 6 week period. The tighter the better for me because I don't like spending all my time in lambing barns. It's very labor intensive. So when we pick the lamb in the center that's 90 days, and there's going to be a few that are going up to 100 days and a few that are back toward 70 or 80 days. So there's some variation, but all of them are eating well. So anytime after 60 days, if I had to wean a lamb early, I wouldn't have any reservations about it being able to sustain itself on feed, because they are very much into the food thing by that age.
Yeah, so of course we're doing things on a much, much tinier scale. And we do actually spread out our kidding, partially because our goats are also sort of entertainment when we are in a normal year. And my cheese making school is located on the farm. So a lot of people that come to the classes are primarily coming to see baby goats. So we try to kid between, maybe a 3-month window. So that we always have some little kids. And so we are weaning, based on the age of the kid. And we typically do a 90-day weaning because we are mostly dam raising with some bottle feeding, but even the bottle fed babies are living with the dams. And so they do start eating pretty early that way because of imitation. So when you have a bottle raised kid that isn't living with their dams, and if you have a kid pen where you're doing all the bottle raising, they typically don't eat as quickly. So I would say, yeah, within the first, couple of weeks, they're definitely imitating, and you see them walking around with a little piece of hay sticking out of their mouth and they're smacking their lips, but they don't know that they really know what they're doing yet. But we do feed dry hay year round. And then we also do supplement the does with grain and usually some alfalfa pellets and some other supplements like sunflower seeds and things like that. Most of that, the dams are getting on the milk stand, so the kids aren't getting that, but we give everybody a little bit just as kind of a treat. And so they'll start eating. And then even in terms of weaning, usually if it's a wether or a buckling, we may wean them a little sooner if we really need that milk. But because we're not really a commercial dairy and the milk is sort of a supplement for what we do, and we do some milk sales when we have extra, usually I will let the kids have the milk for at least 3 months, and I'm only getting whatever's extra. I mean, sometimes I do have a really big producer that I'll go ahead and she might be nursing 2 kids full time, and I'm still milking her twice a day because she's got enough extra that I can have some. I won't milk her all the way out, obviously, but I can have some and she can still feed those 2 kids. So I'll have access to some of the milk in the first 3 months. And then once the kids are weaned, then I get all of the milk. Again, I'm not trying to be a big profitable milk dairy. And so I can do it that way. And I find that the kid growth and their happiness and their overall health is just better if they're getting that mother's milk, as opposed to, I never feed replacer. The only time I'll ever feed replacer is colostrum replacer if I absolutely have to and have no other choice. Very rarely do I do that. If I do need milk and I have, let's say, a wether that I don't feel really needs the nutrition as much as the other babies, because they're not really going to do any work physically in their life, I may, take that mother's milk and give that wether just cow milk, grocery store cow milk, which I'd much rather give than milk replacer. And he might do fine, but usually I'll leave the doe kids on their mom for at least 3 months. And if they are being dam raised, if I really need the milk, I will separate them and wean them myself. But a lot of times I'll let them self-wean. Some moms will kick them off at 3 months and some will let them nurse for a year. So, it varies on our farm.
I will add, with lambs, we do use a commercial lamb replacer when we have a bottle lamb. We prefer that over a cow's milk or other sources. It's just they seem to do better. We've tried different approaches, but we typically have some lamb replacer, milk replacers somewhere in the refrigerator just as a backup.
So for bottle babies, because I mean, I know from my own experience, the lambs are never full. They're constantly asking for food, and if they see you, they'll be baying and making noise. What is your guys' strategy or management on feeding the bottle babies? Because you're either making your own or you have some that you're filling up the bottles yourself. What is kind of your typical strategy on how much do you feed them? At what point does that increase? How often do you feed? Um, so if you guys could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Well, we're probably a little less scientific than Tim because he's doing this big commercial production. But when we do have to bottle feed a baby from birth, which again isn't usually a choice that we would make. I know some dairy goat producers do that automatically with all kids, pull them at birth. They never nurse at all, and they're doing it all. We usually only do that if we have to. Either it's a weak kid or a mother who perhaps we had one doe that had a positive CAE test, caprine arthritis encephalitis. We were pretty sure it was a false positive because there was no real reason she should have, and we had actually just vaccinated her, which can give you a false positive, kind of forgot. But because we didn't know, and that disease is passed through milk, we had to pull her kids just from a safety perspective. So if we do have to bottle feed from birth, those first few days, we're going to just be getting an ounce or two in at a time, and we're doing it probably every few hours. But within a couple of days, we're going to try to start getting them on a schedule. I tend to, because we have a small number and I'm working from home, especially this year with the pandemic, we weren't going anywhere else anyhow. we would do 4 times a day with the bottle for the first week or two. Then we'd go to 3 times a day. And then within, usually within a few weeks, we could go to twice a day. I have to confess, I tend to do a 3 times a day because I'm out there checking them at the noon hour anyhow. And I just figure, well, we'll go ahead and feed them then too. And then we can go down to once a day by the time we're getting further. I think the most important thing though with a new kid, because like Delaney said, the ones that have a good appetite will eat themselves sick, and so definitely monitoring their, rather than go with a specific ounce size, because the kids might be different sizes and at different ages, really monitoring how their belly is feeling. You want it to feel full, but you don't want it to feel hard. If you've got a hard belly, you have way overfed that baby, and that's going to lead to a lot of discomfort and some potential problems. So just not letting them, some will stop on their own, but most won't because, if they're good eaters, they'll just keep eating, and it doesn't seem to occur to them that they should stop.
Very similar. To start off 4 times a day is ideal. But that gets old real quickly. So we're trying to get that lamb from 4 to 3 as soon as we can. And it depends on the lamb. If a big robust lamb that can take a fair amount of milk, then we're going to drop him back to 3 times pretty quickly. If it's a smaller lamb that's weaker and has had some issues, then we're going to be more cautious or feed smaller amounts more frequently. So it turns into a subjective assessment, and I'm reluctant to throw a formula out there because it's a matter of judgment, and you need to watch that lamb. And I totally agree with Kate's, keep an eye on that belly. You don't want them distended, but you want him to get enough that it's a value to him. So it will vary from individual to individual, but most of our lambs, within a few days, we're back to 3 times a day. And then if they're going in that creep feeder, we see activity, then we're going to go to twice a day, because I want him to be a little bit hungry so he gets on feed and he's less reliant on the milk replacer. And then we'll go to once a day, and then we'll stop. So the intervals will vary depending on the lambs and how aggressive they are and how well they're eating. And if I tend to put these lambs together if I have more than one, but if they're very different as far as size or vigor, I may keep them separated, because the more aggressive, larger lamb may push the smaller one back in those situations. So I'm a little bit cautious about lumping them together. and I'll feed them differently. The big guy is going to be pushed to get on feed quicker, and the smaller guy is going to get a little more attention for a little longer. So it varies, and it is subjective, and it involves, the mothering instinct. You guys would be much better at that than I am. I do have 4 sons, but I tend to, to kick them out the door and say, "Get on with your life." But the dad's perspective is very different from the mother's perspective. But so my wife has a lot of input on how long the lamb gets the bottle and how much and how we manage each one. And she'll say, "Oh, I think he needs a little more. He's not quite as robust." And I say, "Oh no, I think he's doing fine." um, and whether or not it's me out in sub freezing weather, toting bottles around or not. So it does vary. I don't think we can give you a set guidance. It is subjective.
Yeah, and I will also just add middle of the night feedings, because that's a big question a lot of people have. I tend to not like to be up in the middle of the night for the babies or for my cheese. When I teach cheese making, I often tell people, make sure you read that recipe so there's not a step that needs to be done in the middle of the night. I rarely get up in the night for babies or cheese, but I will make exceptions to that. If I have a weak kid, that first night, because the first 24 hours is so crucial, I will get up in the middle of the night and I will feed those babies one night. And then the next night they got to make it through the night. So I'll get up early and feed them, and I'll feed them late at night before I go to bed. But I personally really try to not do those middle of the night feedings, because that'll just burn you out really fast. And for those babies that are that weak, that are going to need that middle of the night feeding, I've usually brought those babies up to the house. And they are in my mud room with, a little heat in there, and it's not quite as big a deal. So I will do a middle of the night feeding if it's absolutely necessary. But I think for a lot of these kids, if they've made it through that first 24 hours and they're eating well, you really shouldn't be needing to get up in the middle of the night, even if they are bottle babies.
I totally agree. And having said that, yes, we've had the box in the laundry room. and at 1 a.m. you hear this bah, bah, bah. Then you have to get up and feed him if you're going to sleep.
But somehow it's a lot easier to do that when you don't have to traipse out to the barn in the middle of the winter, right?
Oh yes, no, I'd rather do that than, especially on those cold weather February lambing. So, but we do make every effort to get him back to the barn as soon as possible. And we will keep heat lamps handy around the barn. If I've got a really cold night coming in and a ewe has had weak lambs, especially a first time ewe, and she's a little uncertain, the lambs are small, I wouldn't hesitate to hang a heat lamp over that jug just to knock some of the cold off. Maybe I'm going overboard a bit because, I do say I want them to do this on their own, but I don't want to abuse them either. I want to be reasonable. And you'll always see a couple of heat lamps hanging around in the barn.
Yeah, and I would say one thing with heat lamps, especially for new lamb or goat owners, is 2 things just to be really careful about. One is to make sure that if you are using a heat lamp, that they aren't forced to be too hot. Make sure that there's space for them to get away from the heat, because overheating is also a problem. And you want to make sure that they can move away from the area where the heat is. And then a bigger issue that I'm concerned about with heat lamps is barn fires. We have had so many barn fires in this area because of heat lamps. And I've almost gotten to the point where I just won't use one. They just scare me. And if I have to use one, I'm going to really make sure that it's very secure and that it's a new enough lamp that it's not going to malfunction, and that there's no way that it can fall down into the hay. But I'm more likely, if it is really cold, to bring kids up to the house. I've even brought a dam and her kids up to the house and just cleared out our mudroom and turned it into a stall. We had a kidding in April one year where it was -9 degrees here on the day of kidding. That's pretty cold. And so these kids were fine. They were nursing, but that was really cold to be 1 day old. And so we brought everybody up to the mudroom rather than put heat lamps. They just scare me. So I would just say, be very careful with heat lamps.
And I
we've had
totally
some.
agree. And yeah,
Yeah, go
we
ahead.
often use a large bulb, 100 watt or larger. But if I do use a heat lamp and I think it's really cold, I'll put up wind blocks as well. We keep some plywood around the barn and we'll lay that against the end of the row or whatever, just to knock some of the wind off, or put some hay bales. But do keep in mind that hay is very flammable. And you have an environment that's flammable, and we never hang the lamps low. They're always high. They're high enough that they're just knocking off a little bit of that edge, so you don't have just pure cold air. So blocking wind is big of a deal, if not bigger, than the heat source. And then keep that lamp certainly far above the heads of the ewe, because you can burn the back of the ewe standing under it, and she may not realize it until it's too late. We do hang them very high. We hang them with a chain, and we use S hooks that we squeeze together to be sure that can't knock them down. And the other concern I have with lamps and safety is managing the cord, because I've seen animals that bit into an electric cord, and if they survived, it leaves a nasty wound. So all of our cords are tied securely at the ceiling or to the post above the animals, so they can't get to them and they run out of reach back to our electric source. So there are some precautions that should be common sense, but sometimes you get in a hurry. So just take a minute and look around the barn and think of the value that it holds to you, and justify the use of it, and then do it in a careful manner. I have also brought mama and babies into enclosed areas, a room or something, at the barn, where I can have a routine heater that's plugged in somewhere in the barn that keeps the pharmacy from freezing, which we do anyway, and just take some of that chill off. They don't need to be cuddled. They're not, newborn puppies and kittens are born fully wooled in the case of our sheep, or good hair coats. They should be. And that's the purpose. That's because they should hit the ground, dry off, fill it with colostrum. The colostrum furnishes the heat source initially, and then the mama's milk, and they should be able to make it pretty well, especially if you've got good bedding. And we'll bed those jugs heavier on cold nights than we would in hot weather. And here in Georgia, sometimes late in February, we're seeing some pretty warm days, and we're actually working to cool things off. And I have had some years that Alami went into March, and so we were more concerned about keeping folks cool while they're in the barn than we were temperature. So for us, the temperature extremes aren't as severe, but my biggest concern with supplemental heat sources in the extreme case where we have a very weak individual, difficult birth, or very small lambs for some reason, and we've got an extreme or exceptional night coming in, and we want to provide a little bit of supplement there. But to Kate's point, be very, very cautious.
Yeah, and I would just add to Tim's point about taking the edge off. You're not, these are livestock. You're not trying to make it as warm as you would like it, right? We are humans. We are used to a very small little range of temperature. So I think that just happens a lot, with livestock owners, especially if they're new to it and they're maybe going to have those livestock more as pets, like a lot of our local 4-H kids might. We might want to treat them like our little house dog, but they are in fact livestock, and they are meant to live outside, and they're very well suited for living outside. And so your goal with the heat lamp isn't to make it super cozy and warm like you would want it to be at that temperature. So just keep that in mind. You're just taking the edge off with that heat lamp. And if they're up and healthy and nursing, and you've got bedding, and you've got them out of the wind, they don't need it, even if it's cold at night. I agree. And you don't want them to get used to that anyhow, because your whole goal is for them to acclimate to their environment. So that too, I think, is just worth saying, because I've seen people fret about, are they going to be cold out there? I'm like, well, you would be, but that's what they're supposed to, that's what they're made for. It's the extremes.
I've seen situations where lambs or kids were protected too much. In other words, someone brought them in a heated environment and they kept them for several days, and then they sent them back out to the barn, and we had a cold snap, and then we ended up with respiratory issues. And in a couple of cases, some pretty severe pneumonias, because the offspring was not allowed to acclimate and adjust to the environment, and that's critical. So again, emphasizing that the heat source is a temporary, transient, get them through a critical phase, but you do not want to over protect these animals because it can do more harm than good. And there can be health consequences from not allowing them to adjust to that environment that they're born into.
I would add to the heat lamp thing too, is that not all of them are made the same.
Yes.
I was raised with reptiles, so like the heat lamp to me growing up is like, oh, so it's like one of those, and it's like no, completely different. They're different for different animals. This one's made for inside versus outside. So just make sure if you're going to use it, and you're making sure you're being careful, that you make sure that if you're buying one, that it's specifically for like outdoor barn type situations, versus just going to PetSmart and buying a heat lamp.
No.
'Cause that's, I mean, I could see someone doing that because in their head that like it's the same thing, but it's not. So
No.
we definitely wanted to make sure that I said that. And then when we go back to bottle babies, because we had them. So I wanted to kind of reiterate, I think something that Tim said is that when you do have bottle babies, we had 4 at one time, and then we added another one once the 4 were weaned. And so when we fed them, we had little hangers for the bottles so that we didn't have to hand feed them all the time. And they would try to steal each other's milk. Once one was done with their bottle, they would run over to get whoever else who was the slower eater to steal their milk. So we would always monitor them as they ate, just to be like, we'd pull some off of the little ones who were slower to eat, and just like we'd pull the bigger ones off, and sometimes we'd separate them once they were done. So keep that in mind if you have bottle babies, and you have more than one. You can separate them if that's the situation you have. But if there's no way to separate them, just make sure that you're feeding them. You're monitoring their feeding so that one's not stealing another's food, because the bigger ones will push the little ones off.
I'll often pull the little one out, just sit him
Yeah.
outside and feed him, because the
Yeah.
big ones they'll finish in a heartbeat. A lamb can empty a bottle in seconds.
Oh yeah, they're so fast. And
Yes.
sometimes if you're not like if you have more than 4, we had 4, so it was easier for us to like kind of keep an eye on all 4 of them. But we actually did end up pulling the smallest one, because it wasn't that the other ones were stealing, she was just being hounded by the other 3 who were done. And it was like, okay, we're done. You need to have peace while you're eating, because they're done, they need to be pulled out. So just wanted to add that. I also wanted to add, I was working full time when we had our babies, and I've heard some people will bring put their babies like in the back of their car if the weather's okay, and they'll come out at like their lunch break and feed them, as long as they're okay. Like I've heard people do that. I was fortunate that I worked as a nanny, so the mom let me bring the kids over because they were like, sure, you can show them the babies. And so I was able to come back to the house and feed them at lunch and bring them back. And so we did that for about a month. But you have to know what your situation is when you have bottle babies and just kind of maneuver that. We were lucky to have a little bit of flexibility. Some people don't. And I think, Tim, you work full time as well. I mean, we all work, but you work off farm, correct?
Up till COVID. Now now my office is in the corner of the living room.
Yeah.
But yes.
But a lot of times before COVID, because I know a lot of farmers now are like, yeah, now lambing's so much nicer because we're actually home.
Yeah.
And so, but like before then, when people are actually at work, you have to keep that in mind when you're having babies.
Yeah,
That is
there's
a
one
big
more
thing.
caution that we're talking about heat sources. I have known people to use heating pads, and I've used heating pads, but be careful, because a lamb can actually burn, or a kid can burn lying on a heating pad.
Mm.
When we use it, is to bring the temperature up if we have a chilled animal. And we'll always have a blanket or a towel on top of it, and we always use the lowest setting, and typically they're in the laundry room. So, I'm trying to get an animal I found this lamb on the pasture, and it's extremely cold and it's very weak for whatever reason, and I'm just trying to get that body temperature up. And I'm also giving it colostrum, warm colostrum, maybe a little warmer than I would typically do, to try to get its temperature up and get some energy into it. But heating pads can be useful, but again, you have to be cautious with those as well, based upon the setting and how long they're on it. And as soon as he's up and about, I get him off of it. He probably doesn't need it, or he should be in a large enough container that he can move away from it. And if he's not mobile, you've got a more serious situation, and you need to be very careful about how that animal's being managed and how you're handling it. And you may need, veterinary support or some other support.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, since we've talked now about heat pads and heat lamps. In the case of a newborn kid, I would say, within those first few days, where they're having a lot more trouble regulating their body temperature. And if they are getting hypothermic, you can't really get food into them before you get that body temperature up, if they're really hypothermic. So two other methods we've used in that case, which is unusual to have happen, but I've had it once or twice. We have a little thing, I call it the hot tub, where we'll actually take a newborn kid or young kid, and we'll put it in actually a plastic bag up to its neck. And then we dunk them into a warm bucket full of water. We don't want the kid getting wet, because then when it comes out, it's going to have wetness to deal with to keep warm. So we'll put it in this big plastic bag and dunk them into the hot or the warm water to really get that temperature up quickly. So that's one method. And then another method is using a box of some kind and a hair dryer, where you can have a box and have the kid in the box and have a hole in the box where you can put a hair dryer in to really superheat that box quickly. So these are very short-term solutions, right? This is like a way to get that body temperature up quickly that will work a little bit better than a heat lamp. I mean, if they're severely hypothermic, you don't really have time that it would take, and it's going to be hard to get that cold of a body temperature up. So those are just two supplemental heat strategies for in that case.
Yeah, I've used those too, and be sure the dryer isn't blowing directly on the animal. It should be above, so it's circulating.
Right.
On the water bath, we use that typically with newborns that are chilled. We find them chilled, and they're almost always still wet. So I don't worry about the plastic bag. I just take that warm bucket and hold him by the neck, and down he goes, and they'll start to move as they warm up. He'll want out at some point. And I have actually stomach tubed them and given them colostrum while they're in the water bath. And in a few minutes, you've got a different animal.
Yeah.
He's warm and he's got the energy from the colostrum, and then we'll dry him off with the cloths and put him back with mama. And by then she's inside in the jug, and then we may or may not use any supplemental sources of heat, depending on the animal and the environmental temperature. And it's a judgment call, but the water bath works super well for these newborns that are caught out in an extreme situation. And mama maybe had twins or triplets, and she walked away with two of them. And that's often when we will see the weak lamb, is the triplet that's been forgotten, because some sheep can't count past two. So we have to work with those situations. So we didn't talk about multiple births, but some breeds are predisposed to litters, like the Finn or whatever. For us, triplets are unusual. We might have triplets once every couple of years. And we almost always end up with one of those on a bottle. I have had a couple of ewes over the years that successfully raised triplets on their own, but they were the exception. And one was a smaller ewe, and she was extremely attentive, and she could count to three. She would, visibly look and make sure they were all with her, and they worked out a system. And I'd let it work, let it go. They all weaned off about the same weight, but she was was the exception. Of course, she got all the feeding love that she wanted during that time because she was making a lot of milk and she was saving me mixing bottles 4 times a day. So she stayed with us for many, many years, but that's the exception. Typically, I'll pull that extra lamb off. I don't know that we've ever had quadruplets with our flock, but in some breeds you'll see that.
Yeah, and so I would say typically similar to us, the Nubians, the full-size breeds, twins is definitely most common. We do have triplets occasionally. I would say most of the time we've had triplets in the Nubians. We've had to supplement at least one of them. Usually it was more of a matter of that the kidding was a little complicated and one of the kids was a little more stressed. And once he was on a bottle, might as well keep him on a bottle. We used to raise Nigerian dwarfs also though. And we had mini Nubians for a few years, and those smaller breeds often had multiple births. And so triplets and quads, we did experience more with them. And I think back to, you know, what Tim and I have been saying kind of through this whole thing is it's not a one size fits all ever.
Yep.
Like sometimes you'll have a doe that can't feed 2 kids. And then sometimes you have a doe that fed 4. I mean, we had quads that were completely dam raised with one doe. She was amazing and they were all exactly the same size and weight. And I don't know how she did it. And now we had that same doe the year before that had triplets and her mother had a single and they had them right within the same couple of days and they co-raised their kids. So the mother would let the extra triplet nurse off of her. And so that worked. But I would say you just have to be always watching what's happening. And, you know, some of them can do it just fine without supplementing and some can't. So I think that if you're hearing nothing else through this whole thing, what Tim and I have probably said over and over again is you have to really be watching and using your judgment and not following some formula because it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's biology. We have had situations where we'd have a triplet and then from one ewe and then another ewe have a single. And we'll take the placenta from the single and wrap it on one of the triplets and give it to the ewe that had the single. So his mom, you know, smells her baby on that lamb. And we've had success grafting. You have to be attentive and you have to rub the placenta all over him. You know, if there's anywhere on that lamb that doesn't smell like baby, she may not accept him. And the 2 spots that the ewes typically are checking are the tail and the head. So we'll soak the head and soak around the base of the tail and then rub everywhere else. And sometimes that'll work if it's an attentive ewe that has a strong mothering instinct. You know, she's more likely to adopt, but that's not always successful. Some large operations, they'll have a lamb born dead or an issue with it, and they'll skin it and wrap the skin around a triplet and put the triplet with that ewe. And so it smells like her baby and she'll accept it. That's a little bit extreme, but some large producers will actually do things like that. But grafting is as much of an art as it is a science, and it depends very much on the temperament and the mothering instinct of that ewe or that doe. But it's something you might think about if you have that situation.
Yeah, and like you said, Tim, how mothering is it's really important for your farm because you don't want to have so many bottle babies. So if that's one of those behaviors you're breeding for, then maybe your flock is just generally stronger in the mothering instinct and that it's more likely that you're going to be successful versus the like really heavily dairy farms that don't care about mothering instinct.
That's true.
If that's something they want to try, that may not work because that wasn't something that you bred for because it wasn't something you were using previously.
Yeah, I'll just add to that what you're saying, Delaney. There's a good point because, you know, in some cases, I mean, I have some does who are super attentive mothers, and it's really hard for me to bottle raise their kids. It would stress them out. And then I tend to have wilder kids from those does because for me to separate those kids from their mom is just too hard on her. Whereas I'll have another doe who's, yeah, she's not the greatest mom. She does her job, but she's not super attached. And it's much easier for me to pull those kids. So I could see a situation where, in Tim's case, he really wants those dams to have strong maternal instincts because he doesn't want to do the work. But I think, and it makes sense. But I think for some people who really want to bottle raise babies because they really want them to be bonded to the human, they might actually be seeking out a mom who's not super maternal to make that transition easier for them,
Yeah.
to the pulling of the babies. So again, that's where I think it just depends on what your goal is.
Yep.
And I think we can separate a little bit of the maternal versus the birthing. Like you still want a mom to have easy births, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's going to be a good mom, because that's more of a caretaking aspect than it is a biological, physically, I can do this.
Right.
So I've got two more questions, and one of them was when you separate the babies, at what point do you return them to their flock? And do you have to be careful about returning them? Will the flock accept them just overall because they're just the same type of breed, as long as it's not trying to connect to a mom, that the flock or the herd will just take them? Or do you have to kind of reintroduce them a certain way?
So in our case, because we're so small, it's a pretty small herd. And the way I have my pens set up, because we do have a barn, so we have inside stalls, and then we have outdoor paddocks. So we have 4 indoor stalls and 4 outside paddocks, and we can make them all separate or we can make them all conjoined. So my goal is to eventually get everybody to be one big happy family. And so again, I mean, it kind of echoes what we were saying about everything else. We kind of watch and see. So when I'm ready to reintroduce, if a baby had been weak and had to be brought up to the house, and I'm probably going to give them at least a week or 2 before I'll put them back in with the whole herd. But I might take them back down to the barnyard as soon as they're ready, and they'll just be in a stall and paddock adjacent to the others so that they're smelling them and getting introduced to them. And then when I feel like they're all ready, usually I'll put them back in. Usually I'm waiting till about 2 weeks to put them back in with the larger herd. And then I'll do it where they're in the biggest open area and so that they have room to get away from any bullies. And I'll watch, and I'll make sure that nobody's really picking on that baby, or that baby's just smart enough to figure out how to get away from the bullies and find hiding places and whatnot. So usually that's what I find works pretty well for us, but we are much, much tinier.
How do you correct the bad behavior from the bullies?
I feel like you really can't. I mean, you're not going to really change that hierarchy. So it's just going to come down to, do you have to keep 2 separate herds for a little while? And, I had one doeling that broke her leg this year. We don't even know how she did it, but she was about 2 months old and we just came out and found her with a broken leg. And so she obviously had to be separate from the herd. And she had one little buddy, a companion, to keep her happy. And so she's always going to be at the bottom of the pecking order now. And so when we reintroduced her to the herd, when she got her cast off, they were just, she was just going to be picked on for a while. So for a good bit of the summer, we had 2 separate herds. We had the gentlest does and the younger does in with her. And then we had the bigger, more aggressive does, until she regained enough strength that we could put them all back together. Because I don't feel like you can change that behavior so much as that you have to manage it.
Yeah, it depends on each person's situation. We're fortunate in that we have multiple properties with pasture. So my rams are on one place, my ewe lambs on another place, and then the breeding flock is here at the house, so I can watch them closest, of course. But as far as reintroducing, those ewe lambs will typically go back in the flock with their mothers and aunts. When I have moved moms and aunts and babies I'm through lambing, when I'm finished up lambing and they're going back into pasture, then I'll start thinking about bringing the ewe lambs back. because mom and aunts are preoccupied with babies. And so when we bring the ewe lambs in, they're not going to be as concerned about the hierarchy and the fighting and pushing. If we're supplementing the ewes, the mamas for some reason, giving them extra feed, which we usually don't closer to weaning, then I may wait and bring the ewe lambs in after we wean. Because I don't want fighting at the feed trough. But if we're not supplementing them, then I found that it's not a bad time for bringing them in because the moms are distracted and they're not as focused on the hierarchical thing. Although I don't know that we've ever had a major issue with the fighting and the hierarchy. They'll, butt each other around and there's some head knocking here and there, but oftentimes it's between the mature ewes because there's just been a disruption to the population. Not so much between the mamas and the ewe lambs. Ewe lambs are smart enough they can't, not big enough to take on mama yet, so they're not going to challenge her. So it depends on your management situation. It's easier for me to manage fewer flocks with larger numbers than it is more flocks or smaller numbers, because that's more stops during the day and more places that we're having to check and feed and supplement and make sure the water's not frozen or whatever, and the fences are good, etc. So we tend to group rather than divide. The ram lambs, the replacement rams that I'm going to keep over, they'll end up with daddy usually by 6 months of age. But again, they're small enough that they know, they're not going to take on those older rams. And there may be some challenges, but they don't last long because daddy will let him know, hey, I'm still the boss here, and next year, you can challenge me again, but right now we're not going to. And I've not had issues with that either. This year we put 6 weaned ram lambs, 6 months lambs in with the ram flock, and we didn't have any issues. Now, that being said, a lot of this is breed and genetics determined. So there's going to be some breeds that are inherently more aggressive, more hierarchical. There are others that are much more social and laid back. So your situation will vary depending on the number of animals in the group and the genetic predisposition and the temperaments. And temperaments will vary as well within any population. So knowing the animals and understanding the animals, it makes it a judgment call. We've had years where we've kept our replacements apart much longer. I've also been asked, how long do you leave your ram lambs and ewe lambs together? Do you wean them together? Yes, we keep them together at weaning. And we'll keep them together for some weeks after weaning. In fact, a couple of years ago, they were 9 or 10 months or 11 months old before I separated ewes and rams. And I was starting to get nervous, but our circumstances were such that we had some pasture issues then and some grazing issues, and we trying to keep them together as long as possible. But I didn't have any pregnancies in those ewe lambs. Now, if you had fin sheep or some other breeds, they may all be pregnant. So you need to understand your breed and the predisposition and the sexual maturity, and when you need to get those rams away from those ewes. And we did have one year back when I mentioned the 200 or so ewes when we decided to reduce that flock. We skipped the year of lambing. We still had one lamb born. She was our first 3/4 Texel. And I have yet to determine how the ram found that ewe. She's the only ewe in the flock that had the lamb. But rams can be very creative. And they can go over fences that you wouldn't think they would cross, or take down panels that you wouldn't think they could take down for the pleasure of getting to the other side. So use some common sense too and understand. And billies can be the same way. They can be pretty determined. So I prefer not to have them in sight of each other. And typically in our situation, we've been lucky that we can take the rams completely off of the main farm where the ewes are. But as I said, I did have one exception one year, and I'm at a loss for what happened. So things happen.
Yeah, we have 2 bucks on our property, and they are in a separate barn on the opposite side of the property. So it's all one property. And we actually like having the bucks on the property because since we hand breed, it also helps us know when the does are in heat. For instance, I have a doe in heat today, and she's standing at the very furthest edge of her paddock, looking longingly over
Yeah.
at the buck. And so it's much easier for me to know, okay, today's the day.
Yeah.
But with our buckling kids, when we do keep them, which we very rarely do, I would say maybe every 3 years, I'll keep a new buckling just to keep, and I have 2 different lines here. So I always keep 2 bucks from 2 different lines so that I can keep breeding. And then I have outside sources too. This mentor that I was talking about that lives 5 minutes away keeps bucks also, and he raises the same breed as me. So I have a pretty good source, but I do try to get the bucklings out of the doe pen by 4 months at the latest is what I feel comfortable with. I've never had any accidental breedings, but by about 3 to 4 months, they're certainly becoming much more interested in their sisters and moms and aunts. And so I try to get them out by 4 months, and then they'll move over. We have 4 wethers over at the buck barn. We have 3 different pens and runs. And so when the bucks are in rut, they're a little too aggressive to live with the wethers. But when they're out of rut, which is the non-breeding time of year, then some of the time bucks can live with the wethers and sometimes they can't, depending on how aggressive they are. But at least they have companionship over there, so they can always see another goat. They're not completely isolated.
So I know we're a little bit over, but I wanted just a real quick answer to one more question, and then we'll just kind of sign off. How do you guys record your the information every year? Do you guys do it paper or electronic?
So I do it paper because I am often selling kids or occasionally selling does, not very often. And so I like the paper to be able to go with them easily. And since I have a small number, it's pretty easy to do. So I have a kind of healthcare record sheet that I keep on every goat where I can make notations of vaccinations and any medications and so on. But because we have such a small herd, that's not too hard for me to do.
I have a barn notebook. It's just a spiral bound notebook, and everything that happens, we try to record everything that happens. It's my goal to, and certainly during lambing season, everybody is recorded. I record dates that rams go in and rams come out. If it's a sick animal, a treated animal, or a foot trimming, anything I do, I'll walk back through. It's in my pharmacy, and I'll write it down, the date and the animal's tattoo number and what we did. So I have a record of who I treated and who lambed. I also use a software called Flock Filer. There are a couple of versions of it. I use the basic version. I have played around with the higher level version, but it's much more information than we need. But I have the entire flock in Flock Filer, and I can bring up genetics and ancestors and look at pedigrees. And I've been a little better this year, historically not so good about getting weights into the system, but this last few years we've been better about getting our first week weights. Don't say that too fast. And our winning weights, etc. in, so I can have some comparison of which breedings and which lines are performing well. So it's been very useful to me. There are different programs out there. Just ask around, see what different people are doing. I keep a lot of data in Excel. I love crunching spreadsheets. Excuse me. And Excel is very useful if I want to list all the lamb's weights, and then I'll run averages and stuff like that. And sometimes when we're weighing everyone through the flock, my 6th grader, who's a computer-minded kind of person, he'll sit there with my laptop and we'll call it out, and he'll type it in to Excel. And then I can print it out and or transfer that into the software, sheep software or whatever. But I love playing around with Excel. It's just a personal preference.
Yeah, we use Excel for our breeding, just, you know, my information, I'm tracking heat cycles, and then keeping at least in one place, I keep the heat cycles and who they're bred to and when they're bred and when the due date is. And then I have,
Yep.
you know, when they kidded and how many kids they had, so that I have one place I can go and look at for that. But for their actual healthcare record in terms of vaccinations and things like that, I keep a separate paper copy.
Great. Great. I love that, like, even though you guys have done this for, you know, years, that there's still things that are changing, things you're trying that it's new, things that you're improving on and getting better. I think that's really good for like newbies to know that like this learning process doesn't stop after a certain point. It's
That's
continuing.
right. It
Um,
never ends.
it never ends. um, so if I'm gonna wrap it up here because I know we're over. So if you guys could just share with our audience where to find you, either your social media handles or your business pages, and then we'll just sign off. So Kate, because I know you have your cheese, I'll let you go first, and then Tim, you can end with yours.
Yeah, so I used to keep two separate websites, and that just seemed silly since really my cheese making school is my main business. So it's theartofcheese.com. And then on that page, you will find a link to Briargate Farm. And if you did type in briargatefarm.com, it will take you to a page on that website. So for website, most of my information on there is cheese making. And then there's a page about goats. And then I do have a Facebook. I have two Facebook pages. One is The Art of Cheese, or just Art of Cheese. And then I also have Briargate Farm for Facebook. And then for Instagram, I have one site that I do both cheese and goats, and that's Art of Cheese Longmont. And then I also have LinkedIn and Twitter, but I don't use those quite as much. So those are probably the main places to find me.
We have a website, southernshorts.net. It was named because some years ago I played around with short stories, and I still like to do that a little bit. So that's the website. It hasn't been updated in a while, but it does have pictures of the flock and some of the routines that we do here around the farm. The software I use to create it is no longer being supported. So we're in the process of trying to come up with an alternative. We like to design our own site and put it together. So I don't know how long that's going to take. Haven't had much time to work on it. But at some point I'll be updating that. It's probably easiest to find me through Instagram. We use Instagram to post pics of the activities around the farm, what we're doing, and I have a lot of interaction via direct messages from people who have questions about the farm and how we do things and what's happening, availability of lamb or health questions or whatever. And I'm glad to respond to those as time permits. So the Instagram listing is under my name, Tim Leard, so it'll pop right up, I hope. I do have Facebook, but I don't, a Facebook account, but I don't go there very often. That's just not enough hours in the day to get around to all of them. And Instagram seems to be friendlier to my mindset for no other reason. So that's the way to get in touch.
Great. I feel like I could talk to you guys forever. I'm soaking up all this information. It's so good. But I'll let you guys go. Thank you guys so much for coming on and talking with me today. It's been so much fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Really nice to meet you, Tim, too.
Happy holidays.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend.
Same here, Kate.
You too.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.